I remember the day I first pulled up to my new house in the sleepy mountainside community of Crestwood Oaks. It was late spring, the dogwood trees were in bloom, and golden sunlight filtered through the leaves. The air was crisp, fresh, and carried a scent of pine. I had moved from a busy city across the country for a life of serene weekends and the chance to hike the nearby trails. Those trails, I'd heard, wound their way through rolling meadows and up the rugged slopes of the national park that bordered our area. However, as idyllic as it all seemed, the first sign that Crestwood Oaks had its share of tension was the sight of small, sternly worded signs staked along the roadside. They read, "HOA rules enforced here. Violations will be noted." I glanced at them and shrugged, assuming any homeowners association would have the typical restrictions. Keep the yard tidy, manage trash bins properly, obey parking limits, that sort of thing. My real estate agent had casually mentioned that our local HOA was strict, but insisted it was to keep the neighborhood looking beautiful. Besides, my job gave me experience dealing with all sorts of rules and regulations, though no one in Crestwood Oaks knew just how deeply that experience ran. I figured I'd sign the forms, pay the monthly dues, and carry on with my life. I'd only just pulled into the driveway of my brand-new, cedar-sided home when I spotted a figure striding briskly along the sidewalk. She was a middle-aged woman, perhaps in her early 50s, with impeccably coiffed hair and a crisp polo shirt embroidered with the words Crestwood Oaks HOA. A clipboard was cradled under one arm. Her expression was set in a tight-lipped smile, one that never quite reached her eyes. She zeroed in on me with hawk-like intensity. Before I even had a chance to open my car door, she planted herself near my mailbox and called out, "Ah, our new resident. Welcome to Crestwood Oaks. I'm so pleased you'll be joining our lovely community." Her tone was sweet, but there was an undercurrent of something in her voice that put me on alert. I managed a polite smile. "Thank you. It's nice to meet you. I'm John Sterling." Of course, that wasn't the name on my official office door, but I'd learned to keep my professional identity discreet until necessary. She introduced herself with a flourish of the clipboard. "I'm Brenda, though most folks call me Karen." She let out a light laugh, though there was a guardedness in her eyes. "I'm the HOA treasurer, and I handle the compliance side of things. I'm sure you've read over the bylaws." Her phrasing of the compliance side of things made me think of a watchdog or a self-appointed community enforcer. I reached over the passenger seat to grab the thick HOA binder I'd been given at closing. "Yes," I said. I reviewed them briefly. In truth, I'd barely skimmed them. I had been too busy settling into my new job responsibilities. I look forward to following them and being a good neighbor. Karen's eyes lingered on my Jeep, which was still stuffed with boxes and personal belongings. She took a note on her clipboard before pointing a pen toward a patch of lawn near my front door. "We do have landscaping requirements and certain color palettes for gardens. It helps maintain the neighborhood's uniform look. You'll find all that in the binder." I nodded, feeling a slight tension in my shoulders. "Of course," I replied politely. "I appreciate the guidance." She offered a narrower smile. "Great. Well, I'll be stopping by from time to time to ensure everything is in compliance." She tapped the side of her clipboard. "Always glad to help. Welcome again." And with that, she marched off. My first introduction to Karen had been brief, but I could sense she was no ordinary HOA figurehead. She reminded me of a private school principal, exacting and borderline overbearing. Still, I tried to brush off my unease. I had no intention of making waves in my new community. If only I'd known how significant her presence would soon become, and how far her overreach would extend. Within a few days of settling in, I discovered that the presence of Karen was felt nearly everywhere in Crestwood Oaks. My neighbors whispered about her in hushed tones. If you placed your trash bins too close to the curb, she'd appear. If your grass stood a fraction of an inch above regulation height, you'd receive a politely threatening letter in your mailbox. It seemed that Karen had no qualms about stepping on people's toes. My next direct encounter happened at the HOA's monthly meeting, held in the small community center adjacent to the neighborhood. The building was cozy, with large glass windows overlooking a forested slope. But the atmosphere inside was tense. About 30 people, mostly middle-aged homeowners and a handful of retirees, sat in folding chairs arranged in rows. A podium stood at the front of the room, flanked by posters listing the top 10 HOA regulations. Karen hovered at the front table, shuffling papers and checking them off her meticulously prepared spreadsheets. The president of the HOA, a soft-spoken older gentleman named Leonard, opened the meeting with a friendly greeting, congratulating a few residents on recent birthdays and anniversaries. But almost immediately, Karen cleared her throat, tapping a pen against her clipboard with impatience. Leonard gave her a nod, and she seized the podium as if claiming dominion over it. "Evening, everyone. I'm Brenda, better known as Karen," she announced. "We have several pressing matters to address regarding compliance. Specifically, we have 2 or 3 households that have neglected to maintain property standards." She paused, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on me. "Mr. Sterling, would you stand up, please?" I felt the weight of everyone's gaze, but I complied politely. "Yes." Karen fixed me with her keen stare. "We noticed you placed a bird feeder on a tree outside your home. While we appreciate your enthusiasm for local wildlife, Crestwood Oaks has guidelines about altering the environment, including installing feeders in certain locations." I forced a smile. "Oh, I wasn't aware. I'll check the guidelines again. It's in Section 2, Paragraph 4. Karen replied with a hint of condescension. "You'll need to submit a formal request and wait for approval before attaching anything to HOA-managed trees." The whole exchange felt uncomfortable, as though I were a child being scolded. I promised to rectify the issue, and Karen moved on to other violations around the neighborhood. Eventually, after nearly 2 hours of her enumerating rules about flower bed colors, allowable porch furniture, and even the recommended shade of house paint, we adjourned. I realized the neighbors quietly rolled their eyes as they filed out. There was a sense of resignation. This is how it's always been. She always wins. A few neighbors patted me on the shoulder sympathetically, welcoming me, but also cautioning me to stay off Karen's radar. One even whispered conspiratorially that she tried to keep track of who parked where and made note of any perceived infractions. I listened politely, but a bigger part of me was itching to explore the beautiful wilderness beyond the last row of houses. The entire reason I had picked Crestwood Oaks was the promise of nature at my doorstep, the wide-open trails weaving through the national park. No meddlesome HOA enforcer was going to dampen that excitement for me. I had come here to find solace in nature and, ironically, to keep a close eye on it for reasons no one suspected. My secret was one I hadn't shared with anyone in Crestwood Oaks. I was the newly appointed director of the National Park Service. Most people assumed that the director worked out of Washington, D.C., or a big city office. While that was partly true, I had an office in D.C. and traveled regularly. I also had the freedom to reside in a place of my choosing, so long as I could perform my duties and remain available for official business. After years of living in metropolitan areas, I yearned to be closer to the parks I served. So, quietly, without fanfare, I had purchased a home on the outskirts of a national park where I could have direct access to the land and stay connected to the people who used it. I wanted to understand firsthand the real-world implications of policies and changes I'd be overseeing on a national scale. Moving to Crestwood Oaks had been the perfect solution. At least, it had seemed that way until I'd run into Karen and her overbearing methods. My usual morning routine involved driving to the park's administrative offices, a modest structure about 15 minutes away. I'd pass scenic overlooks, watch deer grazing in the early light, and it gave me a surge of joy every time. When not traveling on official business, I'd work from a home office. I had yet to announce my position to the neighborhood, primarily because I didn't want to create a stir or become the target of endless requests about local park management issues. Local property owners often had strong opinions about park boundaries, hunting restrictions, and land usage. I preferred to maintain some anonymity for as long as I could. One crisp morning, I decided to hike one of the nearby trails before starting my official tasks. With the sun just cresting the tree line, I strolled along a narrow path that connected Crestwood Oaks to the national park boundary. The forest was awash in the bright chirping of birds, the gentle sway of branches, and the scurrying of small woodland creatures. I breathed in the scent of damp earth, stepping carefully around protruding roots and patches of wildflowers. But as I went deeper, I noticed something unusual, a wooden gate, newly erected, that stretched across the trail. It was a crude barrier, made of planks hammered together and topped with a warning sign. "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be fined." I frowned. The sign bore the Crestwood Oaks HOA logo, and in small letters beneath, it read, authorized by HOA Treasurer Karen Arnett. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. This trail had been open to the public for decades, connecting state-protected land with national park territory. It was one of the reasons many hikers and nature enthusiasts visited the area. Yet here was a blockade, forbidding entry. For a moment, I considered whether there could be some legitimate reason for the closure, perhaps a hazard or ongoing construction. But the sign's stern wording, plus Karen's name, suggested something else. Her habit of controlling her environment seemed to have expanded beyond house paint rules and bird feeders, now stretching onto land that wasn't even under the HOA's jurisdiction. The brazen arrogance of it galled me. I knew better than to remove it myself. There was a process for handling these matters, especially if the barrier had no legal permit. Instead, I took photographs of the gate, the sign, and the immediate area, logging GPS coordinates on my phone. Then I turned around and continued my morning walk along an alternate route, quietly fuming at the audacity. Back at the park office later that day, I locked myself in my private workspace and started pulling up maps, land records, and any documents pertaining to Crestwood Oaks. Decades ago, the developers of the neighborhood had negotiated an easement with the state, guaranteeing public access across certain trails that connected private land to the national park. That meant no one, least of all an HOA, had the authority to unilaterally close off or claim these paths as private. I also reviewed local ordinances and park regulations. If Karen had indeed blocked a publicly accessible trail, she was likely violating county and state codes, plus potentially infringing on federal jurisdiction if the blockade extended into national park territory. The severity of the legal consequences would depend on how far her meddling went. In the back of my mind, a conflict brewed. On the one hand, I wanted to protect my privacy and keep my identity low-key in the community. On the other, I was sworn to uphold regulations that protect public lands and ensure free access to designated trails. The very job that had brought me here demanded that I take action. The entire purpose of the National Park Service is to safeguard natural spaces for the public's enjoyment, now and for future generations. I also decided to take a closer look at Karen's background in relation to the HOA. From what little I could gather through community chatter, she was the unofficial muscle behind the organization. President Leonard, kindly as he was, often seemed overshadowed by Karen's forceful presence. It was as though the entire HOA existed under her watchful eye, abiding by her every command. People might have complained, but few stood up to her. I told myself I'd handle the matter with tact, possibly by quietly raising the issue at the next meeting, or even having a discreet conversation with Karen to let her know that she was stepping out of bounds. In a perfect world, she would realize her error and remove the gate. But in my heart, I suspected it wouldn't be so simple. In the weeks that followed, my house slowly took shape. Boxes were unpacked, curtains were hung, and I began building a little reading nook by the window with a clear view of the forest. Despite the looming issue with Karen, I tried to enjoy the simple pleasures of my new home. Meanwhile, Karen's presence in the neighborhood only intensified. I'd see her patrolling the streets in her golf cart, wearing a stern expression and occasionally stopping to talk to unsuspecting residents who had the misfortune of being in their yards at the time. She'd scribble notes on that ever-present clipboard, issue verbal warnings about minor infractions, or remind them of upcoming dues or mandatory repainting schedules. At first, it was almost comical. But day by day, as I witnessed neighbors' exasperation, I recognized it for what it was: unyielding harassment. One sunny afternoon, I bumped into an older couple, the Hendersons, who lived 2 houses down. Their driveway was cluttered with potted plants they were trying to arrange in their garden. They waved me over, offering a warm greeting. "John, can we ask you something?" Mr. Henderson said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Karen showed up here yesterday, complaining about the style of our garden fence. She said it was too tall and would ruin the neighborhood aesthetic." Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "She threatened to fine us $500 if we don't remove it by next month. This fence has been here for years. We just added a fresh coat of paint." I sighed sympathetically. I'm not surprised. She's become quite militant. "She also said something about blocking some of the trails," Mrs. Henderson added, hesitating for a moment. "We love to take our granddaughter hiking. Did something happen?" I considered how to answer. "I spotted a gate across one trail recently, apparently an HOA directive. I'm not sure about the other trails." Mr. Henderson shook his head in frustration. She's lost her mind. Those trails were why we bought property here decades ago. If she tries to close them all, half the folks in this neighborhood will be up in arms. Not to mention the hikers who visit from outside. We talked for a while longer, and it was clear the Hendersons were just two of many homeowners who felt harassed. They whispered about calling a vote to remove Karen from the HOA board. However, in the same breath, they expressed fear that she might retaliate by leveraging her influence or by digging up obscure clauses in the regulations to punish them. As inconceivable as that might sound, it reflected how oppressive her presence had become. I tried to reassure them. The best course might be to stay calm. Document everything. If she crosses legal lines, there are ways to address it. They looked unsure but nodded. I could see the weariness in their eyes, the burden of living under constant scrutiny from someone who wielded a modicum of power but exercised it far beyond any reasonable scope. The next HOA meeting approached more quickly than I expected. Held once again at the community center, it was packed. Word had spread about the gate blocking the hiking trail, and longtime residents were disgruntled. Karen sat at the head table, her arms folded, a smug expression on her face that suggested she was fully prepared to fend off any dissent. President Leonard tried to open the meeting with the usual community announcements, but it wasn't long before a resident stood up, voice quavering with barely suppressed anger, demanding an explanation for the unauthorized trail closure. Karen wasted no time grabbing the microphone. That trail was causing an influx of strangers onto our private streets. It's a security concern. We have to protect our properties and ensure outsiders don't roam freely. A murmur of discontent rumbled through the room. Someone shouted, "That's a public easement. You can't just block it." But Karen held up a hand for silence, her voice calm and authoritative. According to Section 5, Paragraph 12 of our HOA bylaws, any situation that poses a significant security threat to the neighborhood can be addressed by the committee. The presence of so many unknown hikers was becoming problematic. She paused, her gaze scanning the crowd. "We have the right to protect our investment." Another neighbor demanded, "Who voted on this?" I don't remember any discussion about closing trails. Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Emergency measures can be taken by the treasurer and president. Leonard and I discussed it. It's not permanent, just a temporary closure until we can create a permit system for hikers." All eyes turned to Leonard, whose face had gone ashen. He looked flustered, muttering something about concerns over litter and unruly hikers. Clearly, Karen had strong-armed him into going along, or he was too meek to stand up to her. Perhaps a bit of both. I couldn't remain silent any longer. Rising to my feet, I said loudly, "The property in question extends beyond HOA land. That gate isn't just blocking an HOA-managed sidewalk. It's cutting off a public easement leading into state and federal land. We have open access policies in place specifically for that route." A tense hush fell over the room, and Karen's eyes zeroed in on me. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate your passion for hiking, but this matter is more complex. That trail cuts directly through Crestwood Oaks property before it enters the park. We have every right to regulate who uses our land." She spoke in a tone as if explaining something obvious to a clueless child. My patience was wearing thin. Still, I tried to stay composed. "I think you'll find that the easement was granted decades ago, and the trail is public. You'd be in violation of county ordinances, and potentially more, for blocking it." Karen's lips tightened into a thin line, but she forced a brittle smile. "Well, I guess we'll have to see about that. Perhaps you can show us the evidence at the next meeting." She set the microphone down abruptly, signaling the end of open debate. The rest of the meeting was overshadowed by tension, but Karen breezed through the other agenda items as though the matter were settled. Meanwhile, neighbors whispered to one another, many scowling in Karen's direction. I wondered if she realized that she was stirring up a hornet's nest, and that, eventually, she would have to face consequences much larger than an annoyed group of suburban homeowners. Later that evening, after I returned home, I decided to check my mailbox. Among the usual flyers and bills was a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed text. "Stop interfering. This is none of your concern. We know who you are, John Sterling." Chills prickled across my skin, though I tried to stay calm. My instincts told me Karen might have something to do with this, but I couldn't be certain. Anyone in the neighborhood or on the HOA board could have sent it. The message was vague, but the implications were clear. Someone wanted me to back off from the trail controversy. And that mention of "we know who you are" hinted that my real identity as the director of the National Park Service might have leaked, or maybe they just meant to intimidate me personally. Either way, it wasn't good. The next morning, I contacted a colleague in the Park Service's legal department. I explained the broad strokes of the situation, minus any specific personal details about the HOA's internal politics. My colleague, an experienced attorney, assured me that if someone was blocking a public easement to federal or state land, the legal ramifications were severe. She offered to expedite a review of the relevant property deeds and local ordinances, and then coordinate with county officials if needed. I felt relieved to have official support in this matter. Even if the situation escalated, I knew that federal law was on the side of preserving public access to designated areas. Nevertheless, I was anxious about how the local community might react when it became clear that the new guy had the power to bring down an avalanche of legal trouble on the HOA, especially on Karen, who seemed to be the mastermind. A few days later, while sipping my morning coffee, I heard a commotion outside. Peering through the window, I saw Karen marching up my driveway, her face set in a grim mask. Behind her were two men, presumably laborers contracted by the HOA, carrying metal stakes and fencing material. I stepped out onto the porch just as Karen arrived. She wasted no time. "Mr. Sterling, we have orders from the HOA to mark the boundaries of this property to ensure no encroachment on HOA land. We've had complaints about your landscaping possibly exceeding your lot lines." I stared at her, dumbfounded. The only landscaping I'd done was some light planting in my front yard, well within my property. "Excuse me? My yard is well within my boundaries. You don't have any authority to put stakes on my property without a survey or my permission." She sniffed haughtily. "We have the right to inspect. It's in the bylaws. If you disagree, you can file an appeal with the board." I could feel my pulse thrum in my temples. I'd known Karen would escalate, but this brazen harassment was a new level. "Unless you have an official survey from a licensed land surveyor showing I'm in violation, this is trespassing," I warned. One of the hired men shifted uncomfortably, looking from me to Karen. She thrust her clipboard at him. "Do your job," she snapped. "Wait," the man said. "We're not surveying. We're just installing these markers along the line you indicated." He pointed at the scrawled map on Karen's papers. "We can't be sure it's accurate." Karen glared at him, then turned to me. "We'll be back with a formal notice. And you'd better be prepared to defend yourself at the next meeting, because your attempt to undermine our trail security measures isn't going unnoticed." She whirled around, gesturing for the men to leave. They followed her with uneasy glances in my direction. I took a steadying breath, the anger still surging within me. This was beyond petty. It was a direct attempt at intimidation, a tit-for-tat maneuver, because I'd challenged her on the trail closure. Karen was playing with fire, and she didn't even realize how hot things might get. After that incident, the tone in Crestwood Oaks shifted even further. Neighbors who had once been friendly seemed more cautious in greeting me. Others, however, approached me in private, quietly encouraging me to keep challenging Karen. Some speculated that she was planning to close additional trails, referencing cryptic remarks she'd made about protecting the neighborhood from invasive elements. Each new piece of gossip painted her as more paranoid, more power-hungry. Meanwhile, I began noticing suspicious vehicles parked near my house at odd hours. Dark sedans, tinted windows, always idling for a few minutes before driving off. It could have been unrelated, salespeople or service vehicles taking a break. But my gut told me Karen might be having me watched, or at least trying to unnerve me. My phone rang often at night. I'd answer to dead air, or the click of someone hanging up. My mailbox filled with strange letters accusing me of bringing trouble or suggesting I'd regret meddling in HOA affairs. It was classic intimidation, but I refused to cower. Behind the scenes, my colleagues at the Park Service were gathering all the legal ammo necessary to force the removal of the illegal gate. The only step left was to notify local authorities. But the question was, should I approach the county directly, or give Karen one final chance to back down at the next meeting? A part of me, the part that valued peaceful resolutions, wanted to reason with her, to show her the legal documents and explain that she was risking severe penalties. Maybe, if she realized she was outmatched, she'd relent. However, The other part of me recognized that Karen's arrogance and sense of self-righteousness were so entrenched, she might not yield until she faced an official crackdown. And that crackdown could be a rude awakening indeed. As the next HOA meeting drew near, I received a surprising call from President Leonard. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "Mr. Sterling, I'd like to meet with you privately before the meeting. Are you available tomorrow morning, perhaps at the coffee shop in town?" I agreed, intrigued by his tone. The next morning, I found him already seated at a small corner table, stirring his coffee nervously. He looked older up close than he did in the meeting hall, his shoulders hunched with the weight of unspoken troubles. "Thank you for coming," he said, offering a wan smile. I need to talk to you about Karen." I nodded, leaning forward. "I'm listening." Leonard exhaled slowly. "I'm not proud of the role I've played, John. She bulldozes people. She threatened to have me removed from the presidency if I didn't go along with her plan to block the trail. Claimed she had evidence that I violated certain HOA policies. Something about my nephew using the community pool without a guest pass. I know it sounds petty, but we have a strict bylaw that all guests must register." I wanted to reassure him, but I waited, letting him speak. He wrung his hands together. I caved. I let her set up that gate. Then I wrote up a flimsy excuse about security. But this has gone too far. My conscience is killing me. She's closing in on more trails. She's already reached out to a fencing company about them. My jaw tightened. "That's serious, Leonard. These closures are illegal. She could face more than just HOA fines." He nodded grimly. "I know. That's why I wanted to warn you. She's planning to confront you at the next meeting, accuse you of trying to subvert the HOA from within. She's been gathering signatures to propose your expulsion from the neighborhood if you don't comply with her demands. I think she's lost all sense of proportion." My mind whirled. Expulsion from the neighborhood was extreme, but in an HOA with broad authority, it could mean foreclosing on my property or slapping me with astronomical fines if I refused to cooperate. This was turning into a high-stakes battle. But I also knew that from a legal standpoint, Karen's position was shaky at best. Leonard cleared his throat. "John, please, don't tell Karen I came to you. I just needed to ease my conscience. I can't keep letting her run roughshod over everyone." I reached out, putting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I won't betray your confidence, but I need you to do something for me. If she pushes this at the meeting, don't side with her. Refuse to back her claims. The rest of the community needs to see that she doesn't hold all the power." He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I'll try." A week later, the meeting hall was packed to capacity. It was late afternoon, sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes in the air. Residents filled every seat, many standing against the back wall. The tension was palpable. Everyone seemed to sense a confrontation was imminent. Karen, dressed in a crisp white blouse and pencil skirt, took the podium first. She wasted no time, launching into a tirade about outsiders abusing our neighborhood and the pressing need to preserve community order. She spoke at length about the newly proposed measure to close all trails leading out of Crestwood Oaks until a formal permit system could be established, a system which, conveniently, she alone would administer. Murmurs of dissent rippled through the crowd, but Karen ignored them. Finally, she fixed her gaze on me. "And as many of you know," she said, voice dripping with disdain, "we have a new resident, Mr. Sterling, who has shown disregard for our rules. He's repeatedly challenged our authority, even interfering with our security measures." A hush fell. All eyes turned toward me. I stood slowly, stepping into the aisle. "With respect, you're the one interfering, Karen. You've blocked a public easement." She pointed an accusatory finger, eyes flashing. "That so-called public easement crosses our private property. You have no right to challenge it." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Leonard fidget uncomfortably, but he remained silent. I drew a deep breath, then spoke in a calm, measured tone. "I've consulted official records. The land in question was designated as a public right-of-way decades ago, ensuring hikers could access the trails. You've erected a gate in direct violation of county and federal regulations. If that gate isn't removed immediately, there will be legal consequences." Some gasps, some applause. Karen's face flushed red. "Is that a threat?" I met her gaze steadily. "It's not a threat. It's a fact." Then, choosing my moment, I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a small sheaf of documents. Furthermore, I have the official land surveys right here, along with legal opinions from the county office. They confirm that the HOA does not own the portion of land where you've placed the gate. Karen's composure wavered. She grabbed the microphone again. Those documents could be forged. We have our own lawyers. She sounded frantic, but she soldiered on, scanning the room for support. Leonard, she barked, tell them the board approved this. That you and I worked on it together. Her tone teetered on panic. Leonard stood, clearing his throat. He looked like a man on the gallows. Karen, I can't continue. I can't keep pretending. He swallowed hard. We never had the authority to do this. You forced this measure through. An explosive wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Karen's expression went stony. What are you saying? Leonard's voice trembled, but he pressed on, tears in his eyes. I'm done lying for you. You threatened me, threatened my family, if I didn't help you close the trail. I'm sorry. It was as though a grenade had gone off. The room erupted in gasps and exclamations. Karen dropped the microphone, her face contorting with rage and shock. Residents surged forward, peppering her with questions, condemnation, and anger. Several longtime neighbors demanded she step down from the HOA board immediately. Others shouted that they'd been bullied by her. The once intimidated crowd found its collective voice, furious at how far she'd taken her power trip. Karen tried to retort, but her words were lost in the uproar. At that moment, I slipped out of the room, letting the wave of righteous anger wash over her. My part in the drama was played, but I knew it wasn't over. The real consequences would come once the higher authorities stepped in. Within days, the county received formal complaints from multiple residents, bolstered by my documentation. Park Service attorneys also filed their own complaint, citing the illegal blockade of federally protected trails. Official letters were sent to the HOA, warning that if the gate was not removed, further legal steps would follow. But Karen, true to form, refused to capitulate. She doubled down, insisting that her actions were justified. She hired a small-time local lawyer who parroted her talking points about community security. However, the tension now spread beyond the neighborhood. A local news station caught wind of the story. HOA blocks public trails, residents furious. And soon reporters were filming outside Crestwood Oaks, interviewing neighbors who recounted tales of Karen's bullying. With the spotlight on her, Karen still refused to yield. Her arrogance was stunning. She gave a disastrous interview where she claimed that simple folk don't understand the complexities of land ownership, and that she was only doing what any responsible community leader would do. The backlash was immediate. Even people outside Crestwood Oaks were outraged at what they perceived as an elitist attitude. Meanwhile, I stayed in the background, quietly gathering more evidence. The county's legal counsel reached out to me, confirming that I was correct about the easement. They also prepared a potential lawsuit against the HOA if the blockade remained. It was a swiftly moving chain of events, and it seemed inevitable that Karen would face legal repercussions. And then, the final straw. The local sheriff's office conducted an investigation, spurred by multiple complaints of harassment and possible fraud related to HOA funds. Rumors swirled that Karen had used HOA money to pay for personal expenses, including the cost of installing the illegal gate. If that were true, she was in for far more than a civil suit. What Karen, and indeed almost everyone else in Crestwood Oaks, didn't realize was that my identity as the director of the National Park Service meant I had direct lines of communication with state and federal authorities. As evidence piled up, I cooperated fully with the sheriff's office, county prosecutors, and other agencies. My testimony and official position carried weight. When Karen finally learned who I really was, it must have been a bitter pill to swallow. She confronted me on a chilly autumn morning, marching up my driveway yet again, fury burning in her eyes. You, she hissed, jabbing a finger at my chest. I found out who you are. Director of the National Park Service. You set me up. I stepped back, raising my palms. I didn't set you up. You blocked public land. That's on you. She fumed, her composure unraveling. You tricked me, posing as some ordinary resident. You're behind this entire crusade. I shook my head calmly. I'm doing my job, Karen. Protecting public land is literally my sworn duty. And your attempts to intimidate me or the neighborhood are over. The authorities are involved now. She looked near tears, her bravado mingling with desperation. You can't do this to me. I'll sue you for harassment. This is my neighborhood. I run this HOA. I crossed my arms. For now, maybe, but not for much longer. She spun around, storming off, her whole body trembling with outrage. I knew the legal wheels were already turning. There was no stopping them now. The final act of Karen's downfall came swiftly. The county issued a cease and desist order, mandating the immediate removal of the illegal gate. A group of local contractors arrived, accompanied by law enforcement, to dismantle it. There were cameras rolling, and the public watched as the path was restored. Many residents cheered as the barrier came down, a symbolic moment of liberation from her oppressive rule. Within a week, additional charges were filed. The sheriff's investigation uncovered evidence that Karen had misappropriated thousands of dollars in HOA funds for personal use. She'd hidden the expenditures under various line items in the budget. This constituted fraud, and the penalties were stiff. The district attorney pressed charges, citing multiple counts of embezzlement and other financial crimes. Neighbors who had once feared Karen now turned their backs on her, furious that she had used their dues to finance her personal vendettas and ambitions. It was one thing to impose petty fines for minor HOA infractions, but stealing from the community crossed an unforgivable line. Finally, the morning of her arrest arrived. A pair of police cruisers pulled up to her driveway in Crestwood Oaks. Officers knocked on her door while curious neighbors peered from windows or gathered in small clusters, whispering. Karen, disheveled and pale, emerged to face the police. She tried to maintain some shred of dignity, but her face was etched with panic. When they placed her in handcuffs, reading her the charges, I saw her head droop in defeat. It was a stark contrast to the imperious figure who used to stride through the neighborhood issuing commands. The entire community seemed to exhale in collective relief as she was led away. Karen's arrest rocked Crestwood Oaks. The local news stations covered the story extensively, recounting how the HOA treasurer had illegally blocked public trails and diverted HOA funds for personal expenditures. Analysts pointed out the brazen disregard for local and federal regulations and how her arrogance had been her undoing. Legally, Karen faced a host of serious charges. The county prosecutor indicated that jail time was likely, given the scale of the fraud and the harm caused to public lands. Furthermore, civil suits were filed by both the HOA, now under new leadership, and various residents who had been targeted by Karen's intimidation tactics. In the end, the judge seized Karen's assets to repay the embezzled funds. Her once pristine home in Crestwood Oaks was confiscated and sold at auction to cover her legal fees and restitution. The same property she had lorded over others was now stripped from her. It was a dramatic, humbling fall from grace, one the entire community watched unfold with a mixture of relief and, for some, schadenfreude. As for Crestwood Oaks, the HOA leadership voted in a new board, one determined to be more transparent and less intrusive. President Leonard stepped down, acknowledging he had let Karen's bullying go too far. He moved to Florida soon after, seeking a fresh start away from the memories of this ordeal. In Karen's absence, a sense of renewal swept through the neighborhood. Residents began to smile and wave at each other again. People hosted barbecues without fear of violating obscure rules. The atmosphere lifted from tense surveillance to genuine camaraderie. The trails were restored to full public use, and the community took pride in welcoming hikers and nature enthusiasts from far and wide. Months after Karen's downfall, I hiked along the trail she had once tried so fiercely to seal off. The wooden gate was gone, replaced only by a small sign. Welcome to the Crestwood Oaks Trail. Please respect the land. On weekends, families with children ventured out, marveling at the rustling leaves and the occasional deer sighting. Dog walkers strolled amicably, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors and visitors alike. I paused at a scenic overlook where the trail cut through a grove of cedar trees. Gazing out over the rolling hills of the national park, I felt a deep satisfaction. This was what the National Park Service and open access was all about. People connecting with nature, not hemmed in by fear or intimidation. In time, the story of the HOA Karen who tried to block a public hiking trail but ended up facing the full weight of the law became local legend. New residents heard about it and marveled that one person could wield so much petty power, only to lose everything in the end. Occasionally, I still fielded a question or two about the ordeal, especially from neighbors who hadn't realized my role in it. But mostly, life in Crestwood Oaks moved on. People repaired fences, replanted gardens, and welcomed friends from near and far to explore the trails. Freed from Karen's overreach, the neighborhood blossomed into a genuine community, one that valued both personal freedoms and shared responsibility. As for me, I continued my work as director of the National Park Service, overseeing policies that protected countless acres of public land across the country. Each time I flew to D.C. or visited another park, I carried with me the reminder of how precious, and sometimes precarious, public access can be. And each time I returned to my home on the edge of this beautiful park, I smiled, knowing that the open trails and vibrant community were proof of what could be achieved when one stands up for what's right. Karen's story ended behind bars, her property seized, her reputation in tatters. It was a severe punishment for a severe abuse of power. But the true victory belonged to everyone who could now walk these trails, breathe in the mountain air, and feel the peace of unspoiled nature, unburdened by fences or gates. That was the real triumph. A community's renewed faith in the simple truth that public lands belong to everyone.